Mildred Harriet, or Miss Harriet as the neighborhood fondly called her, stood at the edge of her garden, the sun casting a warm, golden glow over the rows of flowers she had carefully nurtured over the years. Each petal, each leaf, seemed to breathe life into her quiet little corner of the world. To most, it was just a garden, a pretty collection of blooms, but to Harriet, it was a sanctuary of memories, resilience, and enduring love. Her hands, aged and weathered yet steady, traced the edges of a delicate rose petal. The roses were her pride, planted when she and her late husband, Samuel, moved into the house over 3 decades ago. Samuel had always said, "A garden reflects its gardener's heart." And if that were true, then Harriet's garden was a testament to both her sorrows and her triumphs. Every flower had a story: lilies for her parents, sunflowers for her children, and lavender for the friends who had come and gone. As she moved through the rows, Harriet's mind wandered back to the day her new neighbors, the Wilsons, arrived. The house next door had been vacant for some time, and Harriet had hoped for quiet, respectful occupants. Instead, she was greeted by the raucous energy of 3 boisterous boys and their stern father. The boys, Jake, the eldest, followed by twins Ryan and Ben, were a whirlwind of noise and chaos, bringing life to the neighborhood in a way Harriet wasn't sure she appreciated. Their presence was hard to ignore. Within days of moving in, the boys' laughter and shouts filled the air, often accompanied by the clatter of basketballs, the thud of feet racing down the sidewalk, and the occasional crash of something fragile. Harriet, though accustomed to her peaceful routine, tried to be patient. They were children, after all. Yet, patience was tested the day her flowerbeds fell victim to their antics. It had been a particularly bright afternoon, the kind that beckoned you outdoors. Harriet had been pruning her roses when the basketball soared over the fence, landing squarely in the middle of her marigolds. Before she could even react, the 3 boys tumbled into her garden in pursuit, their heavy steps crushing delicate blooms. Jake, tall and brash, retrieved the ball without a word of apology. His brothers followed suit, giggling at their triumph, oblivious to the damage they had caused. "Excuse me." Harriet's voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable edge. The boys froze. Jake turned, his dark eyes meeting hers with a mix of defiance and surprise. "This is not a playground. These flowers are important to me, and you've trampled them without so much as a sorry." For a moment, there was silence. The younger twins shifted uncomfortably, but Jake stood his ground, his jaw set in a way that reminded Harriet of someone forced to prove their strength. He muttered something under his breath, too soft for her to catch, before turning and leading his brothers back over the fence. No apology, no acknowledgement of the damage done. As Harriet knelt to inspect the broken stems, she felt a wave of emotion: anger, yes, but also something deeper. It was as if the sight of her marigolds, once vibrant and proud, now crushed and wilted, mirrored a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to feel. She thought of Samuel and how he would have approached the situation with calm wisdom. He would have reminded her that patience and kindness often reached further than anger ever could. But Samuel wasn't here, and Harriet wasn't sure kindness would be enough this time. That night, she sat by the window, staring out at her garden under the pale moonlight. The marigolds, even in their battered state, seemed to glow, resilient despite the day's events. Harriet felt a pang of guilt for the bitterness that had risen within her. She knew the boys weren't the true enemy. Life had taught her that often. Those who hurt others are themselves hurting. Perhaps these boys were no different. The next morning, Harriet was back in her garden, replanting what she could. Her hands moved methodically, each motion soothing her frayed nerves. She was lost in her work when she heard a soft, hesitant voice. "Miss Harriet." She looked up to see Katie Wilson, the youngest of the Wilson children, standing at the gate with a small pot of lavender in her hands. Katie's eyes, wide and sincere, reflected a vulnerability that reminded Harriet of her own grandchildren. "I'm sorry about my brothers," Katie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't mean to hurt your flowers. I brought this for you." She held out the lavender, her small hands trembling slightly. Harriet felt her heart soften. Here was this child, offering a gesture of peace amidst the chaos her family had brought. She took the lavender, her fingers brushing lightly against Katie's. "Thank you, Katie. This means a lot," Harriet said, her voice warm. "Would you like to help me plant it?" Katie nodded eagerly, stepping into the garden. For a few quiet moments, they worked side by side, the scent of lavender filling the air. Harriet found comfort in the simplicity of the task and the presence of the little girl. But their moment of peace was shattered when Mr. Wilson's sharp voice cut through the air. "Katie, get back here now." Katie froze, fear flashing in her eyes. Harriet saw the grip fear had on the child. And before she could reassure her, Katie was running back to her house, leaving Harriet standing alone with the lavender. As Harriet watched Katie disappear, she felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and fostering hope where there was none. The garden, her sanctuary, had become a battleground, but it could also be a place of healing. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy quiet. Like the calm before a storm, Harriet's garden began to take shape again. The marigolds regrowing. The lavender Katie had gifted her now taking root. But despite the growing peace in the soil, the air around her house seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The Wilson boys were still around, their laughter and shouts often reaching her ears. But there was a distance between her and them now, one that she could feel deep in her bones. Harriet could sense something stirring, something unresolved simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't long before she had her answer. One crisp morning, as she worked at the edge of her garden, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. This time, it wasn't the carefree noise of children at play, but the heavy, purposeful steps of Jake Wilson. He appeared at the gate, his face tight with defiance. "Miss Harriet," he called, his tone clipped. "I need to talk to you." Harriet looked up from her work, her hands still gripping the gardening trowel. There was no mistaking the challenge in Jake's voice. He wasn't asking for permission, he was demanding her attention. "What is it, Jake?" Harriet's voice was firm, but beneath her calm exterior, she was steeling herself for what was to come. Jake pushed open the gate without waiting for an invitation and strode into the garden. His eyes flicked over the rows of flowers. But there was no sign of regret or apology. Instead, he looked at her, his jaw set, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I want to know why you're always yelling at us. Why do you care so much about your stupid flowers?" His words were laced with irritation, a simmering resentment that seemed to be bubbling to the surface. Harriet stood her ground, refusing to let his aggression shake her. "Jake, it's not about the flowers. It's about respect. You and your brothers destroyed something that meant a lot to me. You didn't care. You didn't even apologize." Her voice softened, but there was a firmness in it that left no room for argument. He scoffed. "What's your problem? It's just some stupid flowers. You're acting like we killed something important." Harriet's heart clenched. She had expected this, in some way, but hearing it spoken aloud still stung. "Jake, it's not just about the flowers. It's about showing kindness to the things and the people that matter. It's about learning how to be gentle in a world that can be harsh." Jake didn't seem to understand, his gaze shifting to the ground as if trying to fight back the anger rising in him. He clenched his fists at his sides. "You don't get it," he muttered under his breath. "No one cares about stuff like that. All people care about is winning. Being strong. My dad says that. He says it's the only way to get by." Harriet could hear the bitterness in his voice, the words shaped by someone else's worldview. She knew who that someone was, Mr. Wilson, whose harshness permeated the air like a thick fog. Harriet had seen it before. The way some parents shaped their children's lives with fear and anger. She knew it was hard for Jake to break free from that mold. To even imagine that there might be another way to live. I know your father doesn't teach you to think about these things, Jake, Harriet said quietly, but you can choose a different path. You can be kind. You can choose to respect what others hold dear. Jake's eyes flared. And for a moment, Harriet thought he might snap. But then, something unexpected happened. His gaze faltered. His chest heaving with emotion, though he tried to hide it behind an angry sneer. He turned sharply, and without a word, stormed back through the gate, leaving Harriet standing there with a sense of both victory and sorrow. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Harriet sat on the porch, reflecting on the encounter. She hadn't expected Jake to change overnight. In fact, she knew deep down that it wasn't about Jake alone, it was about his father, Mr. Wilson. His stern, authoritarian presence loomed over the boys, shaping their every move and making it nearly impossible for them to see the world through a kinder lens. Harriet had hoped, even briefly, that Jake might see the truth in her words. But she knew it was a long road ahead. As the evening light dimmed, Harriet heard a soft voice from behind her. Miss Harriet. It was Katie, standing timidly by the porch. The little girl's face was somber. Her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and longing. Come here, sweetie, Harriet called gently, motioning for her to sit beside her. Katie took a hesitant step forward, her hands clutching the sleeve of her jacket. I'm sorry about what happened, Katie whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake doesn't know how to fix it. But I know it was wrong. I don't want to be like that. Harriet's heart softened as she looked into Katie's wide, earnest eyes. She could see the struggle in the child's face. The internal conflict that had been set in motion ever since she first stepped into Harriet's garden. Katie didn't have all the answers, but there was a tenderness in her spirit that gave Harriet hope. You're a good girl, Katie, Harriet said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be like them. You can choose kindness. Just like I'm trying to. Katie nodded slowly, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. She sat in silence beside Harriet for a while, both of them watching as the sky darkened into twilight. In that moment, it felt like a silent pact had been made between them, a bond of empathy. A shared understanding that would carry them both forward in the days to come. The following days were tense. Like a taut string stretched to its limit. Harriet could feel the atmosphere around her becoming more charged with each passing hour. The Wilson boys were never far from her thoughts. Especially Jake. He had stormed off that afternoon. But Harriet sensed the struggle still brewing within him. She wasn't naive enough to think things would change easily. But a small seed of hope had been planted. And that was enough for her to hold on to. One morning, just after dawn, the distant sound of footsteps disturbed her quiet routine. Harriet was in her garden, as usual, tending to the blossoms that seemed to respond to her care with newfound vigor. She turned. And there he was, Jake, standing by the fence, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He didn't look as angry as before, but there was something different in his stance. Something uncertain. Harriet stood still, waiting, her hands folded gently over the soft petals of a rose she was tending. She had no intention of backing down, but she could see the hesitation in his eyes. I didn't come to cause trouble, Jake said, his voice rough but quieter than before. I wanted to talk. Harriet studied him for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. Then let's talk. Jake stepped into the garden without waiting for an invitation. But this time, his steps were less aggressive, more measured. He didn't seem like the same boy who had barged in only days before, full of defiance and anger. There was something raw in his expression, a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. I don't get it, Jake muttered. kicking a small stone on the ground. Why do you care so much? You keep saying it's about respect. But it's just flowers. It's just dirt and plants. Why do you let it get to you so much? His words came out in a rush, as if he were struggling to articulate a question that had been eating at him for days. Harriet let the silence hang for a moment before speaking, the weight of her experience guiding her response. It's never just about the flowers, Jake. It's about how we treat the things that bring us peace. How we treat each other. When people act without care, without kindness, it breaks something inside. Not just in the person who's hurt, but in the person who does the hurting too. She paused, her gaze meeting his. I know your father doesn't teach you this, but you can choose differently. Jake's expression flickered. But I don't know how, he whispered, almost as if ashamed of the admission. Harriet's heart ached for him. She could see the confusion and frustration written all over his face. The conflict between what he had been taught and what he was beginning to understand. But Harriet also saw something else in him, a flicker of desire for something better. Something kinder. He was tired of the cycle. Even if he didn't fully know how to break it yet. You don't have to figure it all out today, she said softly. Sometimes change comes in small steps. It starts with understanding why something matters. And then it becomes a choice. A choice to do better. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there, eyes cast downward, as though the weight of her words was settling on him. Harriet gave him the space he needed, knowing that sometimes silence could be the most powerful thing. Before he turned to leave, Jake paused. I'm sorry for what I did to your garden, he said quietly, his voice almost hesitant. I didn't mean to make you upset. Harriet's heart swelled with something close to relief. But she didn't let her emotions show on her face. Thank you, Jake. I know it wasn't easy to say that. Without another word, he turned and left, his footsteps quieter than before. Harriet watched him go, a mixture of hope and uncertainty swirling inside her. She couldn't be sure of what the future held for Jake or for the Wilson family. But in that moment, she felt a shift, a crack in the wall of hostility that had stood between them. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Harriet found herself reflecting on the small victory. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was a step forward, a glimmer of light in the darkness. She knew there were still challenges ahead, that Mr. Wilson's shadow loomed large over their interactions. But Harriet had learned long ago that change didn't happen overnight. It happened in increments, in quiet moments of understanding, and most of all, in the willingness to continue trying, even when it felt like the world was pushing back. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, a soft voice called from the gate. Harriet turned to find Katie standing there, a small smile on her face. Miss Harriet, she said, her voice brimming with something new, something stronger. Jake said he was sorry. I think he's really trying. Harriet smiled, her heart warmed by the words. I hope so, Katie. I truly do. Katie nodded, her eyes bright with a quiet determination. I think he'll figure it out, she said softly, just like I did. In that moment, Harriet knew that the journey was far from over. But the seed of change had been planted. And with it, the hope that one day, the Wilson family might learn to treat each other and the world around them with the kindness and respect they all deserved. The calm after Jake's apology didn't last long. In fact, Harriet knew deep down that the peace was fragile, like a delicate flower on the brink of wilting. She had seen this before, moments of promise that were quickly overshadowed by deeper, unresolved issues. The Wilson family might have begun to show signs of change, but the weight of years of conflict, of harsh words and even harsher actions, was not so easily lifted. It was late one evening when the storm of tension finally broke. Harriet had spent most of the day tending to her garden, restoring what had been damaged in the past few weeks. She had a quiet hope that, despite the setbacks, the flowers could heal, just as people could. She found solace in the rhythm of pulling weeds, trimming away dead leaves, and planting new seeds. But that evening, as the last light of dusk faded into night, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again reached her ears. Her heart sank as she recognized the familiar crunch of gravel beneath heavy boots this time. More than one set. Harriet turned slowly, her stomach tightening. And there they were. The Wilson boys, Jake and his two younger brothers, Ben and Charlie. Their faces were obscured by the shadows of the fence. But the sense of malice in their movements was unmistakable. They didn't even bother to knock on the gate or announce their arrival this time. With reckless abandon, they surged into her garden, their laughter echoing through the stillness of the night. Harriet stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she could trust what she was seeing. The anger she had felt earlier, when they had first vandalized her garden, was nothing compared to the cold, simmering fury rising inside her now. "Hey," she called out, her voice steady, though every muscle in her body screamed for her to run to them and stop them. "Stop right there." The boys froze for a split second before continuing their rampage, now deliberately trampling the flowers beneath their feet. It was as if they were doing it to provoke her, to remind her of their power, of their defiance. Her roses, her irises, the delicate blooms she had nurtured for so long all trampled underfoot. Harriet's chest tightened with a grief so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. "No," she cried, moving forward quickly, but with as much composure as she could muster. "You can't just keep doing this." But the boys ignored her, their laughter growing louder, echoing across the street like an invasion of the quiet world she had worked so hard to protect. Ben was the first to notice her approaching, turning to face her with a mischievous smirk. "What's the old lady going to do now?" he sneered. Harriet's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear take hold of her. "I'm calling the police," she said firmly, her voice trembling only slightly. "This has gone too far." As she reached for her phone, her hands shaking, a brief flash of doubt flickered in her mind. Would the police even take her seriously this time? She had already been dismissed once. What if they ignored her again? What if no one cared about her garden, her sanctuary, her peace? It didn't matter. She realized. She had to do something. "Don't do it, Miss Harriet," Jake said suddenly, stepping between her and his brothers. His voice was softer now, and there was a trace of guilt in his eyes. "They're just messing around. You don't need to call anyone." "Messing around?" Harriet repeated, her voice low and filled with disbelief. "You're destroying something I've spent years building. This isn't just messing around, Jake. This is cruelty." There was no answer. Instead, Jake stepped aside, and the other boys continued their destruction. Harriet stood her ground, heart heavy but resolved. She couldn't back down now. With a deep breath, Harriet dialed the police again. When the dispatcher answered, she explained, in calm but firm words, what was happening. She described the boys, their actions, and the repeated destruction of her property. Once again, Officer Martinez's voice came through, dismissing her concerns with a tone that stung. We've been over this. It's just kids being kids. We can't do much unless there's real damage." Harriet's grip tightened around the phone. "Real damage," she repeated, her voice rising. "How much more damage do I have to endure before it's real enough for you?" There was a pause before Officer Martinez responded, his tone cold. "We'll send someone to make a report. But I can't promise anything more." Frustration boiled inside her, but she knew she had no choice but to wait. And so, she stood there in the night, watching her sanctuary being destroyed, feeling the helplessness rise in her chest like a suffocating weight. It was only when the boys grew bored and began to leave, with one final taunt hurled over their shoulders, that she could exhale. But the damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. Harriet looked over the wreckage of her garden. The roses were bent and broken, the delicate petals crumpled into the dirt. But beneath the anger, beneath the sorrow, Something deeper stirred a resolve to fight back. To stand firm for herself and for the peace she deserved. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, or if she even had the strength to take it. But as the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Harriet felt a new understanding. She had fought hard for her peace, and she would not let it slip away so easily. The next day, as the sun filtered through the trees, Harriet couldn't shake the feeling of quiet devastation. Her garden, once a sanctuary of beauty and life, had become a battlefield. She spent the morning surveying the damage, unable to bring herself to work on it, as if doing so would somehow make the assault more real. Each broken stem and crushed bloom seemed to mock her efforts, mocking the peace she had fought so long to cultivate. It was a solitary morning, filled with the hum of the city and the distant sounds of life continuing. But Harriet wasn't interested in the world beyond her garden. She was too tired, too worn from the constant battles. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was deep, emotional, a gnawing feeling that perhaps, in the end, nothing she did would ever be enough. But just as she was about to retreat into her house, there came a soft knock on the garden gate. It was tentative, almost uncertain, and it caught her off guard. She looked up to see Katie standing there, her small figure framed by the wooden gate. Katie was the youngest of the Wilson children, and although Harriet had often seen her from afar, she didn't know her well. The other boys had made it clear that Katie was under their influence, but there was something about her that always seemed different, softer. "Katie," Harriet called, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" Katie hesitated before stepping forward, her eyes darting nervously as if unsure whether she should be there. Her expression was a mixture of guilt and confusion, and Harriet felt a pang of sympathy. Katie stopped herself, clearly struggling for words. "I'm sorry about my brothers. They didn't mean, well, they did mean to hurt your garden, but I don't think they understand how much it matters." Harriet's heart softened. It was the first time Katie had spoken so openly about the situation, and the depth of her vulnerability was striking. Harriet motioned for her to enter, the door of her sanctuary opening wider to this fragile but genuine connection. Katie stepped inside the garden slowly, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She didn't speak for a moment, instead kneeling beside one of the crushed flowers, her fingers brushing the broken petals as if trying to repair them with the gentleness of her touch. Harriet watched her, feeling a rush of empathy. There was more to Katie than the playful, defiant attitude she had seen in her brothers. There was a deep inner conflict brewing beneath the surface, a conflict that Harriet knew well from her own experiences. "I'm sorry," Katie repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be like them. I don't want to hurt things. Not like that. But it's hard. They listen to Dad, and he says things that make it sound like it's okay to hurt people like you." Harriet stood still, her chest tight, not with anger but with a profound sadness. She had known that Mr. Wilson's influence over his children was toxic, but hearing Katie speak about it in such an honest, raw way made the weight of it all more real. The pain of a young girl torn between her own kindness and the harshness of her father's world was a pain Harriet could relate to, even from a lifetime away. "It's not your fault, Katie," Harriet said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not the one making those choices. But you have a choice now, don't you? You can choose who you want to be, no matter what your father says." Katie's eyes lifted to meet Harriet's, and for a brief moment, Harriet saw something in her, a glimmer of understanding, a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Katie, for the first time, wasn't just a part of the problem. She was showing that she could be part of the solution. Katie nodded slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I want to do better. I want to help fix this." Harriet felt her heart swell with a mixture of relief and cautious hope. There was still a long road ahead. But in this moment, a small act of empathy and understanding between two people from different walks of life had created a connection that could spark change. You're already helping, Harriet said softly, her voice filled with warmth. Just by being here. By acknowledging the hurt. You're helping more than you know. Katie stood and met her gaze. The weight of her internal struggle still visible in her eyes. But Harriet could see something else now too, strength. A quiet but powerful strength that was slowly beginning to surface. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But maybe. Just maybe. There was hope for the Wilson family after all. The night air was thick with tension as Harriet stood in her kitchen, trying to steady her breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wiped a damp cloth over the kitchen table. Though her mind was far from the task at hand, every fiber of her being was alert, poised for the inevitable. She could hear the soft murmur of the wind outside, rustling the leaves. But it was the stillness that unnerved her. The quiet before the storm. It wasn't long before she heard the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps and muffled voices drifting from the direction of the garden. Harriet's heart sank as she recognized the harsh laughter of the Wilson boys. The unmistakable tone of Jake's voice mocking the stillness of the night. They were back. The thought of confronting them again made her stomach churn. It had become a cruel cycle of violation, resistance, and disappointment. But she had stood her ground before. And she couldn't back down now. Not when the stakes had grown so high. Harriet pushed away from the table, her resolve hardening like a shield around her heart. She grabbed the broom that leaned against the doorframe, its familiar weight a small comfort. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around her, a slight breeze ruffling her hair. She took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the garden. The moon was just beginning to rise, casting a pale glow across the scene. But the shadowed figures of the boys were already moving, preparing to strike again. "Hey," Harriet called out, her voice firm and unwavering. "What do you think you're doing?" The boys froze for a split second before turning to face her. Jake, the eldest, stood with a spray can in hand, his eyes wide with mock surprise. His grin was one of challenge, a defiant smirk that Harriet had come to loathe. "Miss Harriet," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're out here in the middle of the night, all alone, trying to save your flowers again? Pathetic." Harriet's grip on the broom tightened, but she refused to let her fear show. "You've done enough damage, Jake," she said, her tone as calm as she could manage. "Now, I want you and your brothers to leave. I'm not going to let you ruin what I've worked so hard to build." The other two boys, Luke and Sam, were standing a few paces behind, their expressions unreadable. They looked at each other, then back at Harriet. But neither one spoke. Jake, however, took a step forward, his bravado fueling his aggression. "You can't stop us," he spat. "We're just having some fun. What's your problem, old lady?" The sting of his words hit her like a slap. But Harriet refused to flinch. She knew they had been raised with this sense of entitlement, this belief that they could trample over anything and anyone. But what they didn't understand was that she wasn't going to back down, not now. Not ever. "I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've built," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tide of anger inside her. "Not anymore. You can't do this without consequences." Jake laughed. A sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. "Consequences? What's an old woman like you going to do?" Harriet took a deep breath and, with all the calm authority she could muster, replied, "I'm going to stand here. And I'm going to make you leave." For a long moment, the two sides locked eyes, the tension between them so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. Harriet stood her ground, heart pounding. But she refused to let fear cloud her resolve. She wasn't just protecting a garden, she was protecting her dignity, her sense of self-worth. And then, just as the standoff seemed poised to escalate, something unexpected happened. From the porch of the Wilson house, a voice rang out. "Jake, stop." It was Katie. The youngest Wilson sibling had emerged from the house, her face flushed with emotion. Her voice was trembling. But there was something undeniable in her words. Something Harriet had not expected. Katie stepped forward, eyes locked on her brother's with a fierce, newfound determination. "This is wrong," Katie shouted, her voice rising with conviction. "You can't keep doing this. Look at what you're doing to her. It's not right. It's not fun. It's just hurting people." The shock of the moment was almost palpable. Jake hesitated. His spray can still gripped tightly in his hand. His defiance wavered. Just for a split second. As he met his younger sister's gaze. "Go back inside. Katie," he muttered. His voice suddenly defensive. "This isn't your fight." "No," Katie replied firmly, taking another step forward. "It is. It's all of our fight. And I'm done letting you hurt her." The air hung heavy with silence. Katie's words had struck a chord in the boys. And they were now standing in a fragile moment of choice. Slowly, Jake lowered the spray can, his shoulders slumping with a mixture of frustration and guilt. He began. But the words seemed to choke in his throat. Before he could finish, the sound of police sirens in the distance broke the moment. Harriet's heart skipped a beat. She had called the authorities. But she hadn't expected this particular confrontation to unfold the way it had. The sirens were drawing closer. And within moments, the boys had retreated. Their defiance turned to retreat. Katie, standing tall, was the catalyst for their retreat. Harriet watched them go, her mind still racing with the weight of the encounter. But in that moment, she knew something had changed. Katie's bravery had made all the difference. For the first time, Harriet felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of possibility that change could come, not just to her garden, but to the Wilson family as well. The battle was far from over, but this moment was a turning point, and Harriet wasn't about to let it slip away. The days that followed the confrontation with the Wilson boys were an odd mixture of quiet reflection and simmering tension. Harriet found herself pacing the small patch of garden that had become both a sanctuary and a battleground. The flowers, though trampled and scarred, had started to show signs of resilience. As if in response to the turmoil, they began to bloom in spite of the damage, small, delicate bursts of color that seemed to whisper of hope. But Harriet couldn't shake the heaviness in her heart. It wasn't just the destruction of her garden that gnawed at her, it was the brokenness she saw in the Wilson family. The boys' anger was a reflection of something deeper. Something that went beyond youthful mischief or rebellion. Their actions were a sign of something more insidious, something that had been ingrained in them over time. And as much as she hated to admit it, the root of that darkness lay in their father, Mr. Wilson. Harriet spent hours talking to her neighbors, seeking solace in their shared experiences, and trying to rally some sense of unity. But when she suggested they take action, the responses were mixed. Some offered kind words but no tangible help. Others seemed too afraid to get involved. It was a familiar refrain, "It's not our problem or they're just kids. Let them be." But Harriet couldn't accept that. She couldn't sit back and let things get worse. It was on one of these afternoons, as she stood in her garden, contemplating her next move, that a voice called out from behind her, "Ms. Harriet." Harriet turned to see Jake standing at the entrance to her garden, his posture hesitant. He was alone. No sign of his brothers anywhere. The sight of him caught her off guard. She had expected the boys to avoid her after the confrontation. But here he was, standing at the edge of her sanctuary, a sheepish expression on his face. "What do you want?" Harriet asked, her voice softer than she intended, though the edge of wariness was still there. I'm here to apologize," Jake said, his voice rough around the edges, "for what happened the other night." Harriet studied him carefully. His eyes were downcast, avoiding her gaze. But there was a vulnerability in his stance that surprised her. This wasn't the brash, mocking Jake she had encountered so many times before. "Apologize?" Harriet echoed, trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. "You've already said you're sorry." But words don't mean much if you don't show you're sorry with actions. Jake's shoulders slumped. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers running nervously over the hem of his jacket. I know. I wasn't thinking when we destroyed your garden. It was just stupid. And I know I've said some horrible things to you before. Harriet remained silent, allowing the weight of his words to settle. She had been so focused on the boy's aggression that she had never considered the possibility of them truly understanding the consequences of their actions. But here, standing before her, Jake seemed different, more self-aware than he had ever been. I don't know what's wrong with me, he continued, the rawness in his voice catching her off guard. It's just, my dad. He doesn't let us question anything. He says the world's out to get us. That we have to fight back. But I don't know. I don't think I believe him anymore. Harriet's heart softened. The walls she had built around her slowly crumbling. She hadn't realized how much influence Mr. Wilson had over his children. How deeply his anger and bitterness had shaped their worldview. You don't have to believe everything he says, Harriet said, her voice gentle but firm. You have the power to choose your own path. Jake, you can make a different choice. He looked up at her then, a flicker of hope in his eyes. I want to. I just don't know how. Harriet paused, considering his words carefully. She had always believed in the power of second chances. The possibility of growth. No matter how deep the scars ran. She had seen enough suffering in her own life to know that change wasn't instantaneous, it took time, patience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. You're already on the right path, she said. By standing here and acknowledging your wrongs. You've already started the journey. The next step is proving it, showing that you're truly sorry. Jake nodded, swallowing hard as he seemed to digest her words. I'll make it right, he said, his voice quieter but resolute. I'll help you fix the garden. The sincerity in his tone was unmistakable. Harriet felt a swell of emotion rise within her, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. She didn't know if Jake's change was permanent or if it would last. But she believed in the possibility of transformation. In the quiet power of redemption. As the conversation drew to a close, Jake turned to leave. But not before adding one last thing. My sister, Katie, she's the one who made me think. She's the one who made me see how wrong we were. He gave a small, uncertain smile. I guess sometimes you need someone to show you a different way. Harriet watched him go, a sense of hope blooming in her chest. It wasn't just her garden that was being healed. For the first time in a long while, she believed that even the hardest hearts could change. The real work, of course, was only just beginning. But Harriet had a feeling that, together with Jake, and perhaps even Mr. Wilson, they could find a way forward. A way to rebuild not just gardens, but lives. The days that followed Jake's apology were filled with a strange quiet. Harriet noticed small changes in the air around her, less tension, more space for possibility. The garden, which had once been a battlefield of emotions, began to take on a new form. The flowers, though still showing the scars of past destruction, started to bloom with unexpected beauty. It was as if the land itself, too, was healing, responding to the quiet acts of kindness that were slowly but surely finding their way into the neighborhood. But change was never easy, and though Jake had taken a step toward reconciliation, Harriet knew that real healing required more than just words. It required action, a deep, tangible commitment to make things right. It was early one morning when Jake returned, carrying a small bucket filled with freshly dug marigolds. The sight of him, standing at her garden gate, was almost surreal. He had a kind of nervous energy about him, as if he wasn't sure how to proceed but knew that he had to. Miss Harriet, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I brought some flowers. Marigolds. I thought maybe you could plant them in your garden. As I don't know, a way to make up for the damage. Harriet's heart softened as she looked at the flowers, their bright orange petals vibrant against the morning sun. It was a simple gesture, But in that moment, it spoke volumes. She had spent so many years tending to her own garden, cultivating beauty in a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. Now, here was a young man, broken in his own way, offering to help restore what had been lost. "You don't have to do this, Jake," Harriet said, her voice gentle. "But I appreciate it. These flowers, they mean something." Jake shifted his weight, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "I know it's not enough. I can't undo what we did. But I want to help fix it. Even if it's just a small thing." Harriet smiled softly, her gaze lingering on the flowers in his hands. "It's a good start. But you're right. It's just the beginning." As Jake knelt down beside her, carefully planting the marigolds in the soil, Harriet couldn't help but feel a sense of hope stirring deep within her. She had seen how quickly things could fall apart, how fragile even the most solid of connections could be. But she had also seen how moments of grace, however small, could start to shift the course of a life. Jake, in his own way, was beginning to learn that change required more than just good intentions. It required effort, humility, and the willingness to do the hard work. As they worked together, Harriet noticed a subtle shift in Jake's demeanor. The awkwardness that had marked their earlier interactions seemed to dissipate as he spoke of his own struggles, his doubts, and the things that had led him down a path of anger and defiance. He told her, in quiet tones, about the pressure he had felt to be something he wasn't, about the weight of his father's expectations, which had always felt suffocating. And he spoke about Katie, his sister, who had always been the voice of reason in their family, even when he had resisted her. "She doesn't know it yet," Jake admitted. "But she's the reason I'm here. The reason I'm trying to make things right." Harriet listened closely, her hands still gently working the soil as she absorbed his words. She had always known that the greatest lessons came not from confrontation, but from the quiet moments of reflection and connection. And in this moment, as Jake spoke of his sister's quiet strength, Harriet realized that the healing they were working toward wasn't just for her garden, or for him, it was for their entire community. When the flowers were planted, and the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, Jake stood and turned to her. His expression was a mixture of uncertainty and something else, something softer, something like hope. "Thank you, Miss Harriet," he said, his voice steady now, "for letting me help, for giving me a chance." Harriet placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes meeting his with the same quiet conviction she had carried all her life. "You've taken the first step, Jake. That's all anyone can ask for. But the real work, well, that's up to you." Jake nodded, his face filled with both gratitude and a new understanding of the path ahead. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that healing, both for him and his family, would take time. But he had taken the first step, and that was enough for now. As Jake walked away, Harriet stood in the garden, the evening air cool against her skin, and reflected on the quiet power of one small act. There was still so much to be done, so much to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, Harriet felt a sense of peace. The world was full of brokenness, of pain and hardship, but it was also full of people willing to try, willing to do better. And as she looked at the newly planted marigolds, their vibrant petals swaying in the evening breeze, Harriet realized that the same could be said for her own heart. Even after all these years, even after all the scars, it too was still capable of blooming. The morning after Jake's visit, Harriet woke to a sense of quiet optimism. The sun, still low in the sky, bathed the garden in a soft, golden light, casting long shadows on the freshly planted marigolds. She had always believed in the resilience of nature, how it could heal itself even after the harshest storms. But today, she felt something different, something that wasn't just about the garden, but about the neighborhood, about the people she had known for years. As the days passed, more signs of change began to surface. It wasn't just Jake who had started to act differently. The neighborhood, in its own way, seemed to be shifting. Harriet had always been someone who kept to herself, focusing on her garden and her memories, finding solace in the quiet rhythms of daily life. But now, she began to notice her neighbors in new ways. One morning, as she was tending to the roses near the back of her garden, Mrs. Crane, the elderly widow who lived next door, appeared at the fence. She had a bright smile on her face, her arms laden with a small basket of freshly baked bread. "I thought you might like some," she said with a wink. "I see those marigolds you planted, and I thought we could use some flowers of our own around here." Harriet smiled, touched by the gesture. Mrs. Crane had always been a kind soul, though reserved. But now, there was a new energy between them, a connection forged through shared understanding, a quiet solidarity. It wasn't just about flowers or gardens, it was about something deeper, about standing together when things felt uncertain. The following week, as Harriet was working on the far side of her garden, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up to see Mr. and Mrs. Adams, the couple from across the street, walking toward her with a pair of gardening gloves and a small shovel. "We've been talking," Mr. Adams began, his voice a little hesitant, "and we wanted to know if we could help with the garden. It seems like the right thing to do, after everything that's happened." Harriet stood frozen for a moment, surprised by their offer. She had never expected anyone, least of all her neighbors, to offer assistance after the turmoil with the Wilson boys. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about their collective desire to restore what had been damaged. "We're all in this together, Harriet," Mrs. Adams added, her tone warm and sincere. "Sometimes it takes a village, right?" A deep sense of gratitude welled up in Harriet's chest. She had always believed in the importance of community, of people coming together to support one another. But now she could feel the truth of that belief in a way she had never known before. The world, with all its chaos and pain, could also be a place of healing, a place where small acts of kindness could grow into something much greater. As the afternoon wore on, more and more neighbors stopped by, some with plants, others with tools, and still others simply offering their time. They worked side by side, silently, with the kind of unity that comes only when people understand the weight of shared responsibility. Even Mr. Wilson, the father of the Wilson boys, appeared toward the end of the day. His presence was unexpected, but there he was, standing awkwardly by the garden gate, holding a spade in his hands. Harriet turned to him, her expression unreadable, yet open. She had never had a true conversation with Mr. Wilson, only the tense moments when his children had trespassed into her garden. But now, something in his eyes told her that this was different. "I thought I might pitch in," he muttered, his voice gruff. "It's the least I can do after everything." Harriet nodded slowly, surprised by the humility in his tone. "You're welcome to join us." As they worked, Mr. Wilson didn't speak much, but his actions spoke louder than words. He worked beside his neighbors, repairing the fence, trimming back the overgrown vines, and helping to plant new flowers. It was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that change was needed, that the past couldn't be erased, but the future could be shaped with care and intention. By the time the sun set, the garden had been transformed. The damage, once so visible and painful, was now overshadowed by new growth, by the collective effort of everyone who had come together. The flowers, vibrant and full of life, symbolized not just the physical beauty of the space, but the emotional healing that had taken place. The once divided neighborhood now stood united, not just by the garden, but by a renewed sense of connection and mutual respect. As the last of the tools were put away and the evening settled in, Harriet stood in the middle of the garden, surrounded by the people who had helped restore it. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace, peace that came not from perfection, but from the willingness to rebuild, to heal, and to be present for one another in the face of adversity. In that moment, Harriet realized that the garden was no longer just her sanctuary. It had become a symbol of something greater, a testament to the power of community, of love, and of the resilience of the human spirit. And as the evening sky turned to dusk, Harriet knew that, no matter what the future held, they had all taken the first step toward a new beginning. Together. As the weeks passed and the garden bloomed anew, each person who had been part of this transformation carried away their own unique lesson, shaped by the events they had experienced and the growth they had witnessed. Though they didn't speak of it often, it was clear to Harriet that the actions of that summer had changed them all in ways they hadn't fully realized at the time. Harriet stood in the garden one evening, now in full bloom with the care of many hands, and reflected on what had transpired. The weight of her years had taught her patience and resilience. But this experience had given her something more. It had reminded her that while individual strength was important, the strength of a community could weather any storm. She had once believed that her garden, her quiet life, was all she needed. But now, standing in the middle of this renewed space, she understood the truth. Her purpose had always been to nurture not just flowers, but the bonds between people. Harriet's lesson was simple, yet profound. True strength lies in connection and the willingness to stand together, even when it's easier to stand alone. Across the street, Jake Wilson sat on the porch, staring at the garden he had helped to restore. The marigolds bloomed brightly, their orange petals reflecting the early morning sun. He had never thought much about gardens, about flowers or what they represented. But now, every time he looked at that garden, he thought of the apology he had made to Harriet, of the way his sister Katie had stood up to their father, of the collective effort to rebuild something broken. The lesson he had learned was clear, and it stayed with him every day. Jake's lesson was one of humility. Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step toward change. It's not just about saying sorry, it's about showing it through action. Katie, though younger than Jake, had learned a lesson that far surpassed her years. She had lived in the shadow of her father's sternness, his coldness, and his beliefs that often clashed with her own values. But after the confrontation with her brothers, after the support she found in Harriet and her neighbors, Katie understood that change began within herself. She wasn't just a passive observer of her family's turmoil anymore. She was the catalyst for something better. She could be the change she wished to see. Katie's lesson was about courage. You don't have to be like everyone else to make a difference. Standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, is what shapes the future. Mrs. Crane, always a woman of few words, had lived much of her life observing rather than engaging. But as she worked beside Harriet and the others, sharing stories of the past and the lives they had lived, she came to realize how much she had been holding back. It wasn't enough to simply offer a kind word or a loaf of bread anymore. She, too, had something to give, something to contribute to the healing process. It wasn't just about being passive, it was about being active, being present, and extending herself to others. Mrs. Crane's lesson was one of generosity, small acts of kindness, when shared, create a ripple that can change everything. Never underestimate the power of just showing up. And then there was Mr. Wilson, who had for so long been a figure of authority and distance in the neighborhood. The walls he had built around himself, both physical and emotional, had protected him from the vulnerability of relationships but had also kept him from truly connecting with others. When he helped to restore the garden, when he stood beside the others in quiet solidarity, he felt something shift inside him, a recognition of the value of community, the importance of humility, and the weight of responsibility he had toward his family. He knew that he couldn't undo all the harm he had caused, but he could start with the small actions that built trust and understanding. Mr. Wilson's lesson was about redemption. It's never too late to change. And sometimes the smallest efforts to make amends can open the door to a new beginning. As Harriet watched the neighborhood slowly return to its peaceful rhythms, with families gathered in their gardens and children playing on the sidewalks, she knew that the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead. Moments when old tensions flared or misunderstandings arose. But for the first time in years, she felt hopeful. The garden was more than just a space of beauty now, it had become a symbol of renewal and unity. And in the quiet of that garden, surrounded by the lessons learned through hardship and compassion, Harriet realized something even deeper: life, like a garden, needed constant care. It was through small, persistent efforts, through acts of love, kindness, and vulnerability that one could truly cultivate peace within themselves and with others. The garden was no longer just hers. It was everyone's. And as it continued to grow, so did the bonds between them all, strengthening with each passing day.